least healthy foods in the supermarket make the loudest claims. It should be banned that ultra-processed foods are allowed to make health claims.
It's such a large percentage of our public policy nutritional research is funded by pharma. I think this has got to be partially responsible for an upside-down food pyramid. Lucky Charms more nutritious than grass-fed steak.
I'm happy with products marketing how they've been produced. If it wants to say organic, great. But it's the health claim. Just be a level playing field to inspire consumers to learn for themselves.
We're both connected to this Make America Healthy Again movement.
I'm optimistic that we can raise more awareness around this topic and call for better science.
We've privatized profits and we've socialized the expense. Medicare is picking up the cost of this burgeoning, explosive era of chronic disease and morbid obesity.
Obesity has tripled over the past 50 years. Our genes have not changed all that much. Our lifestyle, our food environment has dramatically changed.
In a perfect world, what are some real actionable things that the government could do to make the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time?
The motivation is there to uncouple some of the many conflicts of interest. I remain totally optimistic, but what can they do? I think for one,
Hey guys, welcome back to the Ultimate Human Podcast. I'm your host, human biologist Gary Brecka, where we go down the road of everything anti-aging, biohacking, longevity, and everything in between. And a trip to LA would not be complete without having Max Lugavere back on the podcast. It was one of the best podcasts that we've launched. I mean, the story that you told about your journey with your mother and Alzheimer's, and how you really became an advocate. And I say this all the time. I feel like I start every podcast the same way, but I've truly found that people that are the most impactful, the most passionate, the most driven and purposeful are people that solve the problem in their life. And you really solved the problem when, your mother was probably the closest, I'm going to assume, relative to you, went through that time and you just said, I need answers. And so if you guys have not watched the podcast that I did with Max on the journey with his mother and how he became an advocate for mental health, it's a phenomenal podcast. I linked all of the research in the show notes and even gave a link to the documentary that he did with his mother. I was, before every podcast, and I know you so well, and we just had a great time at the Maha Ball, which was awesome. We had a great time at the Turning Point Ball, which was a great time, other than the weather.
Yeah.
It was like freaking 9 degrees and all the women were walking a mile in open-toed heels.
I know, it was like being in a cryotherapy chamber. Like,
yeah, I didn't think about it that way.
Time,
I should have turned that into a positive and been like, I'm getting all this vasoconstriction and brown fat activation and dopamine, but I was actually pissed off. So maybe the dopamine didn't work.
I know. Well, you're constricted. You're wearing a tux. It's like, oh.
But I ran into a great clip that you did. And I think it was either during a congressional hearing or when you were on Capitol Hill not too long ago. And you made a comment and you said, if your grocery store has a health food section, what does that tell you about the rest of the grocery store? And, as obvious as that is, it just made me go, it is so true. And it's so interesting how, we're both connected to this Make America Healthy Again movement, and we're both committing time and resources and our platforms to it. And it's astounding to me how bad it's really gotten, just how far away from the basics, eating whole foods and nutritious soil and getting back to the basics, the war on saturated fat, the promotion of seed oil, the allowance through grass, this generally regarded as safe guideline that the FDA has that we can actually take microtoxins on a regular basis. And so I want to kind of roam around that with you because I consider you an authority on that. And maybe we should start with one of the most controversial topics, which is seed oils. And I think that a basic explanation of what is a seed oil, why is it bad for you and so pro-inflammatory? We had an awesome discussion before the podcast started about, its impact on LDL cholesterol. And I thought that your viewpoint on that was really good because you talked about the house of cards collapsing on LDL cholesterol. So I wonder if you might expand on that.
Yeah, so seed oils are obviously very controversial today. Everybody's talking about them. I think was very prescient in my, diving into this topic in my book Genius Foods, which came out in 2018, the manuscript I wrote around 2016. And there have been other people sort of broaching this issue. I mean, Weston A. Price, I think, was one of the earliest
people.
Paul
Salandino has been big on it.
Talk about it. Yeah. Dr. Kate Shanahan. The evidence is kind of all over the place. And I think it's a little bit, we have to talk about seed oils, not as a monolith, but with nuance. And, when discussing these kinds of oils, there are the culinary oils like sesame seed oil, which have been used in various traditional cuisines for millennia, which I think can be perfectly healthy and add, great qualities to certain recipes. And I think those are fine. But the oils that are in question, particularly today, are what are sometimes referred to as RBD oils, which stands for refined, bleached, and deodorized oils. So these are the highly marketed cooking oils that have only really had a presence in the human food supply for the past couple of decades. And the issue with these, and even within the refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oil category.
First of all, when you say refined, bleached, and deodorized, I mean, that you should come to a full stop right there, because there's no mechanism in nature for something to be refined, bleached, or deodorized.
Correct. Yes. So, I mean, we've now, I think many of us in the nutrition community are placing an emphasis on awareness around ultra processed foods, right? We generally want to, minimize our consumption of ultra processed foods, which now make up 60% of the calories of your average adult. But what about ultra processed food ingredients? And these refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils are ultra processed. By definition, a food that is ultra processed is something that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen if you tried. Now, you could make sesame seed oil in your kitchen, right? To make sesame seed oil, you press sesame seeds. You could conceivably make extra virgin olive oil in your own kitchen. I mean, humans have been making and consuming extra virgin olive oil for centuries at this point.
I'm a huge fan.
Me as well.
I actually start the morning with a shot of it.
But you couldn't realistically create one of these RBD oils like soybean oil or corn oil in your kitchen. They often require industrial machinery, chemical solvents like hexane. So right off the bat, these oils are ultra processed. We know that. The ultra processing designation comes from the Nova paradigm out of Latin America. And so it's a little bit unclear. I think the technical definition might not necessarily place, corn oil and soybean oil in that category. But they are. There's no question you couldn't make them in your own kitchen. I mean, you would need some serious chemistry to do so. Right.
Plus, most of us don't have hexane and sodium hydroxide just lying around.
Exactly. There's actually there was a viral video on Instagram by a really wonderful content creator, and I forget his name, but I'll send it over to you and you can perhaps include it in the show notes. It's actually a guy who appears to have a chemistry background, attempts to make a refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oil in his home kitchen. And it's pretty terrifying.
Really?
Actually, yeah. all the myriad production steps, but it's nobody's doing that at home for the most part.
I'm going to try to dig that one up.
Yeah.
Callie just did Callie Means, is it another good friend of mine and someone I deeply, deeply respect, just did a post on the sequence in the manufacturing of seed oils. I thought was really good.
Yeah, they're often exposed to high heat. It should be said that processing doesn't necessarily make a food unhealthy, right? Even within the bucket of ultra processed foods are not a monolith. Some are better for you than others. So what is it specifically about refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils that make them ought to inspire caution when over consuming them? Well, for one, they are novel fats. So, again, these didn't exist in the human food supply prior to 50 to 70 years ago. So right off the bat, I think we should, embrace by default what's called the precautionary principle. So the less time a food or an ingredient or a product has, humans have been exposed to it, the more skepticism, the more caution, the higher the burden of proof should be on that food to prove itself as safe, as opposed to the burden of proof being on the consumer or the researcher to prove it guilty, right? It should be guilty until proven innocent. And that's what's referred to as the precautionary principle. It's something that actually in the EU, that seems to be the norm for food additives and the like. Here, the burden of proof is usually on the consumer to prove that something is unhealthy. And usually that occurs years, if not decades after many, many people have been exposed to it. And we've seen that with red dye 3, which was just banned.
Yeah, that was a good move.
After
And
decades.
just a start. We need to go through the other 40 and some of the other ones.
There you go. So I think the precautionary principle is super smart. It's something that we don't generally abide by here in the United States. And I think that's unfortunate. So these ultra processed, oils they're novel, right? Now, again, that doesn't necessarily make them bad, right? So we have to peel back the layers of the onion even further, right? The problem with, I think one of the major problems with these oils is that they're predominantly comprised of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are the most chemically unstable. So among the fatty acids that predominate our diets, you've got unsaturated fatty acids and you've got saturated fatty acids, right? Those are the two major categories. Saturated fats are the most chemically stable. They tend to be solid at room temperature. And under the bucket of unsaturated fats, you've got your polyunsaturated fatty acids and your monounsaturated fatty acids. Polyunsaturated fatty acids are very prone to a chemical process known as oxidation, where essentially the oils go bad. They go rancid. And that process is catalyzed by exposure to light, heat, and oxygen. And so these refined bleach and deodorized seed oils they tend to be predominantly polyunsaturated in nature. And that's not the case for all of them, because there are seed oils like high oleic sunflower oil, which I actually think is fine because it's mostly monounsaturated fat, which has a degree of chemical protection. It's less prone to this oxidative process. But polyunsaturated fats are essentially naked because they're the most prone to oxidation, and they're extracted from the food matrix, which often coincides with antioxidants that protect those fats. In fact, in nature, where you see higher levels of polyunsaturated fats, you also see higher levels of certain antioxidants like vitamin E, whose role in nature is mainly to guard these polyunsaturated fatty acids against oxidation. So in foods where you have higher levels of polyunsaturated fats, you see higher levels of vitamin E, which is why nuts are one of the primary sources of both polyunsaturated fats in the diet as well as vitamin E.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Polyunsaturated fats are not inherently unhealthy. And vitamin E is super important from a brain health standpoint. The problem is when we extract these fats from the whole food matrix and we expose them to these, caustic chemical solvents like hexane or others, and then we expose them to heat, which often occurs during the deodorization process, and then we further use them to cook with, which ironically is what they're marketed as being ideal for, then you're further catalyzing this oxidative process to these polyunsaturated fats, which are very vulnerable. And, oxidation occurs when we ingest these fats in us, but it can also occur in the external environment when they're used in the fryer setting, when they're used to, create ultra processed foods. And so that's potentially really harmful. Right. The other problem is that there are byproducts of oxidation. So it's not just that the fatty acids themselves become oxidized, but all of these other nasty compounds are generated when a high polyunsaturated fatty acid dominant seed oil is exposed to high heat and reheated in particular. You're not just damaging the fatty acids, but you're generating all of these noxious compounds like acrolein and 4-hydroxynonenal, which have been shown to be cancer causing and be associated with conditions like Alzheimer's disease, 4-hydroxynonenal in particular. So
and this doesn't exist in the seed oil initially. This exists when the seed oil becomes oxidized. And I think the oxidation process, which is also a pro-inflammatory process in the human body, when you have oxidative free radicals in the human body, you create inflammation. And you see, again, it's not causal, but it's correlated. You see a significant increase, dramatic increase in the consumption of things like refined sugar, but also the consumption of seed oils. I mean, you really can't get away from them. I mean, even if you go to, and my favorite thing is that most of them have a heart healthy label on them. That's crazy. American Heart Association. So there's a beautiful picture of a heart with a smiley face and the bright eyes that's on the bottle of seed oils. But amount of their consumption too is, people go, well, I don't grab Wesson oil off the shelf, but you start spinning around the labels of your salad dressings and most, a lot of your seasonings and even some, extra virgin olive oils. Until Paul Saladino brought this to my attention, it was a few years ago, I actually thought extra virgin olive oil was extra virgin olive oil. And then when you spin the label around, it's like extra virgin olive oil, palm oil, cottonseed oil, canola oil. And it's right in the bottle and all it says on the label is extra virgin olive oil. And part of, I think, the issue and what, hopefully we're going to help solve with this MAHA movement is that, the average consumer doesn't stand a chance. I mean, I can consider us to be pretty woke and educated in this arena, and, just getting to the grocery store and just getting through that it's a task.
It's like a minefield, right? Yeah.
And so you think about the middle American mother and fathers trying to do the right thing by the family and trying to raise their kids and trying to eat healthy. And, as I'm cruising down the aisle, I see things like fortified, enriched, heart healthy. Okay, those are the things that I'm going to grab and throw in my, in my basket.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a huge problem. And, I'm optimistic that we can raise more awareness around this topic and call for better science. Because the science is a little bit all over the place, and this is a controversial topic. Not everybody. I mean, it's actually very. This is a very unorthodox perspective that we should be avoiding seed oils. I mean, I'll say with all transparency that, like, if you were to ask your average dietitian, for example, what they think about seed oils, they'll say that they're not only benign, they're and not harmful, but they're actually good for you. And so I think. This is something that we're going to need a lot more research to say with certainty, but based on this line of thinking that I've, at least begun to lay out, I think that we should all have a little bit more skepticism around them. And, like linoleic acid, which is the form of polyunsaturated fat that dominates these seed oils, is also found in extremely healthy foods, like, again, nuts and seeds and things like that. And you find linoleic acid in animal source foods, egg yolks, and things like that. And so a lot of the observational data on this, like when they'll correlate blood levels of linoleic acid, for example, to certain health outcomes, it's actually seems positive from that perspective. But there are a lot of confounding aspects to that observation. For one, nuts and seeds and other foods, as I've mentioned, that are high in this fat are healthful. And then also there's what's called healthy user bias, where these oils are adorned with the Heart Healthy logo on them. So a health conscious person might be more inclined to consume canola oil and corn oil and soybean oil. Now, is their health good because of these oils, or perhaps in spite of these oils? Because I mean, that's a health conscious consumer, right? Maybe they're more inclined to take a multivitamin, or maybe they're less likely to smoke or drink alcohol excessively. So
when it comes to snacking, Masa is flipping the script on what real food should look like. Masa chips are crafted with grass-fed beef tallow, one of the healthiest fats on the planet. These chips are packed with essential vitamins like vitamin A, D, E, and vitamin K2, all of which play a role in keeping your skin vibrant, your immune system strong, and your bones solid. But here's the real magic about Masa. Masa's corn goes through an ancient process called nixtamalization, which makes it way easier to digest, and it amps up its nutrient profile. Plus, these chips are low in PUFAs, so you won't find any of the inflammatory seed oils that you find in most snacks, and instead, Masa uses pure Redmond sea salt, giving you a natural hit of minerals that keep your cells hydrated and your energy steady. So don't just snack. Reach for Masa. It's real food, real health, without any of the junk. Grab a bag, and I promise you'll feel the difference. Now let's get back to the Ultimate Human podcast. Well, I think you see such a parabolic rise in nearly all forms of chronic disease: autism, ADD, ADHD, OCD, manic depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, and then also the more physical characteristics: obesity, multiple chronic disease in a single biome, all of which the United States is leading the world in. As we drop to 66th in life expectancy, we are leading in these areas that we don't want to lead, especially after spending $4.5 trillion a year on healthcare. You think, if we spend $4.5 trillion, man, we should all be flying around with a cape.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, for $4.5 trillion, we should be the healthiest nation in the world. But I'm always cautious to say the pandemic of obesity or chronic disease is directly related to seed oil consumption. I think it is multifactorial. This is certainly a factor. I don't think that the jury is out on, oils becoming rancid at high temperatures, and therefore, at least, to be prudent, if you were to wipe seed oils out and add things back in, let's say room temperature oils like extra virgin olive oil, or cooking in high smoke point oils like, coconut oil or grass-fed butter, ghee butter, tallow, some of these oils that actually can withstand those temperatures. Quite frankly, I think things taste better, personally, when you cook in those oils, and they're the only things you really need to have around your kitchen. But this process of oxidation in seed oils, what are some of the outcomes of having these oxidized oils in high volumes in the bloodstream?
Well, one effect, so people can look up, there are many different researchers, working on this, but there have been some really interesting papers, clinical trials by a researcher with the last name of Ramsden and then Taha. And there was one paper in particular that I often cite. It's actually a review, so it's pretty easy to read, by Taha, single author paper published in 2020, looking at linoleic acid and its impact on the brain, which is obviously a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about because my mom had dementia from a young age, and I'll never know what caused her dementia. I don't know if it had anything to do with, her exposure to her lifelong exposure to these kinds of fats. But yeah, it doesn't seem that consuming excessive amounts of linoleic acid, which again predominates these oils in question, linoleic acid has easy access to the brain. And it's a fat that's incredibly prone to oxidation because of its, its polyunsaturated nature. And the human diet is now, saturated with this type of fat. Mm-hmm. I was reading a study that came out in 2023, and it painted the picture very plainly that, in 1910, more than 90% of the fats in the human diet were of animal origin. 90%.
Wow.
Yeah. And now that figure is it's less than 15%. It's way lower. And the bulk of those fats have been replaced by these grain and seed oils. Like most of the majority of fats in the human diet today come from soybean oil.
Right.
And corn oil.
Yeah. And canola.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's shocking. So the fact that these, the idea that these fats are benign and not having some kind of physiologic effect. Yeah. It's just that doesn't even pass logical muster,
Right,
it's
right.
Of course they're doing something. We just have to figure out what that something is. One thing that they do, and this was actually shown in a paper by Ramsden, I forget which year, but people can look this up, is that they increase in the blood something called OXLAMs, oxidized linoleic acid metabolites. And these have been associated with Alzheimer's disease. These compounds.
Atherosclerosis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Narrowing of the arteries. You find a lot of these oxidative species, at the site of inflammation, and also, at the site of, where cholesterol coalesce into, these plaques. And I think often we blame cholesterol for crimes it's not committing. I often refer to cholesterol as a fireman. If your house catches fire, the fireman shows up to put the fire out. But he didn't just show up randomly, right? If this Airbnb had never caught fire, a fireman would never show up in the driveway, right? But if it did, they would show up to extinguish the fire. Cholesterol is usually called to the site of inflammation. And I think it's something that goes lost on a lot of folks. They just think because of the presence of LDL cholesterol, especially if LDL cholesterol is in higher amounts, then I have a higher risk for narrowing of the arteries or arteriosclerosis. But that's like making the argument that if there were more firemen, we would have more fires. But that line of thinking is not true. And I think it is about to be majorly disproven. But one of the things that I liked that you were saying before the podcast started was we have to understand that these polyunsaturated fatty acids are built on the backs of this entire house of cards built around LDL cholesterol. And if one of those cards, like polyunsaturated fatty acids, falls apart, the house of cards starts to come down, because you're like, well, if the fact that because the pro seed oil discussion is, well, they lower LDL cholesterol. And isn't LDL cholesterol terrible? Isn't LDL cholesterol bad for you? Isn't LDL cholesterol the genesis of all heart disease? I mean, shouldn't you, if you have high LDL cholesterol, lower it as low as you possibly can? And if seed oils lower LDL cholesterol, then the argument's over. They're not bad for you.
Yeah. I mean, I've said that LDL cholesterol isn't just a biomarker. It's an industry. And it's not just one industry.
Dude, I love your one-liners, man. It's like, I like the health food line. I'm going to borrow that. You can see it start creeping up in podcasts. Right now.
Yeah. Feel free. Use it. Yeah. Credit me. But, or don't. I don't know.
So it's an industry. This LDL cholesterol is an industry.
Yeah. And so like this notion that seed oils are good for you, refined bleach and deodorized seed oils are good for you. It's true that seed oils reduce LDL cholesterol relative to certain saturated fatty acids. And so you have to accept that as being a benefit, because if that's not a benefit, then suddenly animal source foods are not the dietary villain that they're often made out to be. And suddenly statins, their LDL lowering, effect might not necessarily be, of benefit. Statins have pleiotropic effects. They're also anti-inflammatory, but
exactly.
Yeah.
A very interesting podcast with Dr. Gundry on that, in talking about the research on the minimal impact that that statins had on life extension, which was very, very minimal, and the impact that it had on cardiovascular disease coming from the anti-inflammatory effect, not actually from the LDL lowering effect.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the house of cards that you referenced is something that I think it's really important. Like that seed oils are heart healthy is a card in that house of cards. And for us to challenge that assumption, well, then that might lead to a reassessment of all of these other assumptions that we make about what causes heart disease. Maybe saturated fat isn't the dietary villain that it's often for decades made out to have been. So yeah, that's why I think it's been a real challenge to actually address this stuff, because there's so much commerce tied to it. And I'm not saying that LDL cholesterol is unimportant, that ApoB is unimportant, but heart disease is multifactorial.
Right.
And
I don't think it's directly causal for LDL cholesterol or directly causal for seed oils either. But I think the more of these things, it's interesting as I sort of travel the world and talk to experts like yourself and other experts and PhDs and MDs and researchers and sort of leading minds in the field. Yeah. So we seem to be coming full circle, and just getting back to the basics, a lot about what you talked about, how a lot of these polyunsaturated fatty acids weren't even in the diet in the 1900s. And you also saw very significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is a relatively new phenomenon, especially in younger ages. Not, when in older ages, it was certainly a phenomenon, but it's becoming younger and younger. And so is metabolic syndrome. I read a really interesting article and had a discussion with Dr. Gundry about this, about the metabolic syndrome, which we were discussing before the podcast, abdominal adiposity, hyperinsulinemia, hypertriglyceridemia, elevated or suppressed HDL cholesterol and high blood pressure. We really tend to think of these things as these are older age problems, right? Like we think Alzheimer's, dementia, cognitive decline. I'll start worrying about that in my late 60s, my early 70s. But all of these things have a genesis that's decades earlier than they manifest themselves. And obviously diet plays a huge role in that. Now, I know you're a meat eater, like I am, and I've often heard you dispel a lot of the vegan vegetarianness. I'm not saying attacking vegans and vegetarians, but just dispelling the myth that you can't be healthy unless you're eating an entirely plant-based diet.
Yeah, definitely worth pushing back against, because there's so much money that goes into the promotion of plant-based diets, right?
Right.
But yeah, no, I'm an unapologetic omnivore. I think that people are best suited eating both plants and animals. There's like the ethical question that always arises. And I think that's a good, these are important questions. Animal treatment in this country, particularly in the CAFO system, is like really aberrant, and it's not great for the environment either. But from a nutritional value, I think it's, should not be controversial that animal source foods can play a really important role in the optimized diet. They comprise some of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. Red meat in particular, I think it's a repository for not just really high quality protein, the highest quality protein, but creatine, carnosine, vitamin E. You get a tiny amount of omega-3s in grass-fed, grass-finished red meat. Taurine, even there are carnonutrients, nutrients that are found exclusively in animal source foods that I think we shouldn't be neglecting. And so, yeah, I take a really unapologetic stance. And the epidemiology surrounding red meat is really terrible. It's most of the time I find can't be trusted. Barely scientific. Uses what are called food frequency questionnaires, where within the category of red meat, you'll see hamburgers, right? At the population level, people who are eating more hamburgers or eating more fast food. And it's like, is it the bun? Is it the high fructose corn syrup ketchup on the burger? Is it the French fries that
came with it?
Exactly.
The shake that came with it.
100%. So, observational research tends to paint red meat as a dietary boogeyman. Those observations, those associations are easy to find. Red meat associated with increased risk of colorectal cancer, all this stuff. But the issue is really diet quality. Randomized control trials do not bear out those observations. And those observations also, those increase in risks that you tend to be very small. They're increased, the risks are relative risk, increases in relative risk.
Yeah. Hey guys, let's talk about meat for a minute. Did you know that 96% of the beef sold in stores is not grass-fed? That's right. Most beef comes from cows fed a grain-based diet in feedlots, which isn't even healthy for you or the cow. And even if a label says grass-fed, that doesn't always mean what you think. It means a cow spent at least 50% of its life on grass. So now if you're ready to eat a real nutrient-dense meat that was raised on a pasture, then let me introduce you to Parker Pastures. I love this place. The story of Parker Pastures is as inspiring as it is heartwarming. Chloe Parker, just 19 years old, took over the family business when her mom was diagnosed with cancer. Instead of backing away, Chloe stepped up to lead and turned an overwhelming challenge into a calling. Chloe says it best: "In honor of my mom and for the health of all, I guarantee Parker Pastures meat will always be flavorful, nutrient-dense, and healing for both you and the land." You can order grass-fed and grass-finished beef, lamb, bison, as well as pasture-raised pork and chicken to be delivered straight to your door next week. She delivers to all 50 states, so why settle for mystery meat from the store when you can eat meat that nourishes your body and restores the earth? Visit parkerpastures.com today and you'll get $25 off your order. That's parkerpastures.com and get $25 off your first order.
Now let's get back to the Ultimate Human podcast. Interestingly, we I didn't mean to cut you off, but we talked about this yesterday on a podcast. I had a pediatrician on, and we were talking about statistical data. I have a background in probability and statistics and mortality modeling. And by asking a different question, you can get a completely different answer from the same data. And one of the things that we were discussing was, if you have 100 people in a population, for example, and one person is helped by, let's say, a pharmaceutical intervention, and you tweak that pharmaceutical intervention, and now 1.5 people out of 100 are helped. Well, that's a 50% increase in the efficacy. And so now, consumer sees, wow, there's a 50% improvement in, you would think, well, it went from 1 to 50 out of 100, but it didn't. It went from 1 to 1.5 out of 100. And, the stat claims a 50% improvement, which I guess hyper-technically is true, but when you're looking at the data, it's misleading, and that's a lot of what happens with epidemiological studies.
100%. It's like if they take a group of, we'll just say like 100 people, and they see four of those people getting a negative health outcome related to a certain variable, like red meat consumption, 4 of those people out of 100. And then, another cohort that, maybe is meat avoidant, you'll see 3 people, have the same health outcome. The headline will be 25%
reduction,
risk reduction, right?
Yeah.
But it's just going from 4 to 3. And it's like red meat, maybe was assessed via these food frequency questionnaires, which are notoriously inaccurate.
Yeah.
And there's all of these other variables. There's, healthy user bias. There's multi-collinearity. There's like all of these other
what?
Collinearity, which I got into a fight.
Multi-collinearity. Damn, I've been in the industry a long time. I never heard of that.
I got into a debate on
multi-collinearity.
Yeah. I got into a debate with one of these like vegan science communicators. Their whole shtick is like promoting, their activism around that diet, that lifestyle. And there was they can be so pedantic, and we got into this debate about semantics and healthy user bias versus multicollinearity. They're related concepts. But yeah. So that's why those kinds of studies, I think, are really not trustworthy. They're useful for generating hypotheses.
Right.
But the randomized controlled trials don't really tend to show any negative health effect from the consumption of red meat. In fact, one meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials was just published that found that of all the cardiovascular biomarkers that were assessed across myriad randomized controlled trials using red meat as an intervention, the only potentially negative effect to come from red meat consumption, up to about 6 ounces of, or on average 6 ounces of red meat consumed per day, was a tiny, tiny, tiny bump in LDL cholesterol. And is that bad?
No,
like, probably not. Yeah.
No, so it's not. I did a whole podcast on this with Dr. Asim Malhotra, who's a cardiologist out of the UK. He's up for a cabinet position in the new administration. It's not the American Heart Association, but it's another cardiovascular society, and running the Health and Human Services. And he said the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to decorrelate LDL's direct risk for cardiovascular disease. And we saw this in our mortality tables where we used large data, because when we were determining mortality, we used voluminous pools of data because we were putting people into a cohort of 1,000 lives. And we didn't use randomized clinical trials. We used actual data, day, date, time, location, and cause of death, and triangulated that back into the record. And if elevated LDL cholesterol was correlated to decreased mortality, we would have had it as a risk factor, what we call a morbidity factor or comorbidity factor, but it wasn't. In fact, it was oppositely correlated in older ages, that the higher the LDL cholesterol, the more it was correlated to longevity. We didn't, at the time that I was there, process death claims on centenarians, which we would see from time to time. Sometimes in life insurance, the policy does what they call endows. So if you actually make it to age 100, the death claim pays. So kind of fun to like screw your children and make it to 101 years old and be like, hey, dad just got his life insurance. Fucking 101. I'm going on a bender,
Wow. Yeah.
I just got 10 million tax free. But what was interesting about these death claims is many of them died in, hospital or assisted care living facilities, or, other kind of areas where we had blood work. And universally across the board, they had what we would consider to be, elevated levels of LDL cholesterol.
Wow.
And yet these are the centenarians.
And great longevity. Wow.
Yeah. And great longevity. So he and I went deep down the rabbit hole with this. If you want to check that podcast out, it's Dr. Asim Malhotra. But I saw a tweet of yours that I want to dig into, because I happen to agree with it. Agree with most of your tweets. Aside from being funny, you've got some great one-liners. But you tweeted about the 5 best sports supplements: creatine, beta-alanine, nitrates, caffeine, and protein. And I wonder if we might discuss that. I mean, obviously, I think protein is pretty well vetted and discussed. I don't think anybody considers protein to not be excellent for sports nutrition. But what about beta-alanine, creatine, nitrates, caffeine? Why did those make your top 5 list?
Yeah, well, actually, that was a review that just came out, and it sought to elucidate the 5 top sports supplements. So the 5 top sports supplements, according to this new review, was creatine, which was sort of the king.
I would, by the way, agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it is the most underserved nutrient in 40 plus year old females, especially perimenopausal, premenopausal, postmenopausal women,
Yeah, it's the bomb. I mean, it has a really long historical track record for safety and efficacy. And they're now starting to, research is starting to mount showing that it has a cognitive benefit, supplemental creatine. It can improve cognition when people are underslept, which is a great thing.
Pretty much everybody.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It might have a cardiovascular health benefit. So I think creatine is amazing. I take about 5 grams a day. And it seems to be, I mean, save for people with, kidney disease, and other medical conditions, it seems to be very safe.
And what
very
form
healthy.
of creatine?
Monohydrate by
The
far.
monohydrate or the HCl?
Yeah. Most of the research is on creatine monohydrate.
Okay.
Yeah. So creatine HCl might be as efficacious and safe, but I don't think we know. And monohydrate is super cheap and it's very easy to find. And yeah. Most of the research,
and so
centers on that.
And how does beta alanine play into that?
That's a good question. I mean, beta alanine is not something that I'm all that familiar with, actually, which is part of the reason why I was like reading that research review, because it's not something that I currently use. But it did seem to make the list. And there is this interesting thing. It does give you tingles when you take it.
Like a niacin flush or something?
Yeah, something like that. It does feel very similar to that. But the fact that it made the top 5, I mean, that to me is
and
very
then
interesting.
nitrates, because, we classically would look for nitrate-free meats and consider nitrates to be things that are embedded in highly processed meats.
Yeah.
And are these the same nitrates?
Same.
And wow.
Yeah, same.
So maybe we're coming full circle on the...
Well, nitrates basically support your body's nitric oxide pathway, which normalizes blood pressure, can reduce blood pressure, and also increase blood flow. So, I mean, everybody's familiar with the certain pharmaceutical that works to increase blood flow in a region of the body.
Right.
That's, facilitative of sex.
Right.
But interestingly, there have been some reports and actually some research on people taking that same drug, Viagra, if you haven't guessed, in the pre-workout setting. And it seems to actually improve muscle protein synthesis on par with 100 to 200 milligrams of testosterone in this small study. So nitrates, might have a really powerful effect. I mean, not least of which you're going to probably see a better pump from it, but it might have an enduring impact on muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah. And just so we don't leave the vegans and vegetarians totally out of the conversation, like what are some important things for vegans and vegetarians to pay attention to? I often just highlight the fact that, there's a widespread assumption that if it's not meat, it's healthy. But, if you look at Beyond Burgers and non-burgers and you read the list of ingredients in there, the number that I can't even pronounce and don't even recognize, the polysorbate 80, and there's just all kinds of binders, fillers, gelatins, thickening agents, things that are put in there for consistency that you do not find anywhere naturally in nature. But for vegans and vegetarians, what are they particularly depleted in, and what do they need to replace that a meat, diet is giving them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, vitamin B12, we all know is most easily obtained from eating animal source foods. But if I were going to go vegan, which I won't be anytime soon, but but I would say a nice omega-3 supplement, like an algal based omega-3 for DHA fat, very useful. I don't think we can rely on plant-based forms of omega-3s to adequately support our needs from an omega-3 standpoint. So, I would definitely be supplementing with preformed omega-3 fatty acids. Algae is a great option there. I would also supplement with creatine. At this point, the evidence is pretty strongly in favor of creatine.
Yeah.
So I would definitely take that. Creatine's found exclusively in animal source foods.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's synthesized, so it's vegan. You could take that. Those would be my two, supplemental, I guess, like the high leverage, nutrients that I would look into. There are a lot of other nutrients though that I think are valuable that vegans likely underconsume. I would put choline in there, which is really important for brain health.
Yeah.
You can find choline in in plant-based foods. I mean, choline does exist, I believe, in soybeans and cruciferous vegetables, but in much lower concentration than animal source foods.
So you can supplement it from a vegan source or from a vegetarian source.
I think so. Yeah, there's like...
Well, you definitely could get a choline supplement.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, like citicholine and stuff.
Because I think what, you and I are both involved in really, as we discussed at the beginning, putting our platforms behind this Make America Healthy Again movement, which I'm super excited about. And hoping that it can coalesce into, more of a well-organized movement. A lot of us are trying to do that. In a perfect world, what do you see as, what are the biggest threats right now to society because of our, the corruption in our nutritional research and the corruption in our, food supply, chemicals in our food supply? Like, there's so much, like banning red dye 3 was amazing. And then everybody crawled out of the woodwork and said, what about a red dye number 40? And what about, yellow 90? And I agree with that.
Yeah.
But in a perfect world, where do we start? And what are some real actionable things that the government could do public policy wise, or, to restrict certain corruptive practices to make the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time?
Great question. Yeah. I mean, I'll preface by saying I'm not formally involved in any way in the, the administration or.
Right. I'm not formally involved in the
same. Yeah. We're kind of like tangentially, at this point supporting, it's a fantastic initiative. I remain totally optimistic. I know you are as well. But what can they do? I think for one, RFK Jr.'s, the motivation is there to uncouple some of the many conflicts of interest with our regulatory agencies, whether that's the FDA. Almost 50% of the FDA's budget comes from what are called user fees, which are predominantly from the pharmaceutical industry. So getting...
the Food and Drug Administration's budget comes from user fees. What is a user fee?
So user fees are basically the application fees that these, and other forms of fees that the pharmaceutical agencies pay into the FDA to, I believe, look at data with regards to drug trials and things like that. So sort of like administrative fees that the pharmaceutical companies pay into the FDA. A proportion of that comes from the food industry, but most of it comes from the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah.
Want to get an extra hour of quality good sleep every single night? Let me tell you how I do it. My wife and I sleep on 8 Sleep's Pod 4 Ultra. This is a technology that fits over your mattress to cool or warm each side of the bed, giving you up to an extra hour more of quality sleep every single night. My wife likes her side of the bed warmer than mine, but I've noticed that I've improved deep sleep at cooler temperatures. It even elevates automatically when it detects snoring to improve airflow. With 99% accurate sleep tracking, you can leave your wearables on the nightstand, and I even had this thing independently EMF tested to make sure that I was not getting any extra EMF at night, which I'm not. Get $350 off the Pod 4 Ultra at 8sleep.com/Gary. That's 8sleep.com/Gary, and use the code Gary, Gary, for your discount. Transform your nights and elevate your sleep. Now let's get back to the Ultimate Human podcast.
And what other areas could this movement really make big pendulum swings with, small amounts of action? I've heard Callie Means talk about ending the direct, advertising to the consumer, because that allows the control of the narrative, and it stops anybody from speaking out.
Yeah.
But what are some other areas where this Make America Healthy Again movement can make big strides in short periods of time? Like, what are the must-goes in the food supply?
Yeah. Well, I think that getting pharmaceutical ads off of TV, that's easier said than done, to be fair. A lot of these networks, if you watch the nightly news in America, most of the ads are for pharmaceutical drugs,
right? Right.
So, I don't know the proportion to which the revenue of those companies, those conglomerates, come from their advertising.
It's as high as 74% that I've read.
Yeah. But the crazy thing is that those ads are not even necessarily there to influence consumer spending, which is what even I assumed, prior to Callie coming on to my show and pointing out that no, they're actually spending that money to influence the platforms.
Right.
If you look at every
control
TV
the
show,
narrative and
to control the
media.
narrative. Exactly. As you've said. Yeah. So I think, uncoupling that would be amazing. I think getting the conflicts of interest out of the USDA, which, I don't know how that's going to unfold. I mean, it was just announced that, Trump nominated a former I believe she was the CEO of one of the largest seed oil lobbying groups to be the chief of staff for the USDA. So I don't know how it's all going to shake out. At the point at which we record this, RFK has not been confirmed either. So I feel like there are a lot of moving parts. And once he, if he gets officially confirmed, we might see major sweeping changes. But, I personally would really love to see, this is something that I would love to see. I think it should be banned that ultra processed foods are allowed to make health claims. I think it's really screwed up that you can, that the least healthy foods in the supermarket make the loudest claims. Right. Whereas the healthiest foods in the supermarket don't make any claims. Most of the healthiest foods in the supermarket, the grass-fed, grass-finished red meat, grass-fed eggs, extra virgin olive oil, like very, very seldom will you see any, even in avocados, like you don't see health claims on those foods. Berries, you don't see health claims. Where do you find the health claims? On all the ultra processed garbage foods, the seed oils, the commercial cereals marketed towards children, of course.
Yeah. Wow. I actually never thought about that. That's a really good angle. I mean, it's such a large percentage of our public policy nutritional research is funded by pharma. And I think this has got to be partially responsible for an upside down food pyramid. Lucky Charms more nutritious than grass-fed steak. And if there's any mechanism to flip that pyramid or to be a little more truthful, I'm of the same mindset that you are. We shouldn't restrict free choice, right? Like people buy cigarettes. Obviously, I don't think anybody buys a carton of cigarettes and doesn't know what the risks are, but they're an adult and they know what the risks are. They can grab that off the shelf. I think what you're pointing out is intentionally misleading, heart healthy, fortified, enriched, high fiber. And then on the back, it says high fiber diets are related to improvement in cardiovascular, reduction of cardiovascular disease and improvement in a reduction in colon cancer and things like that. And, leading you to believe that box of cereal reduces the risk of colon cancer.
I'm happy with products marketing how they've been produced. Like I think if it wants to say organic, great, but it's the health claims. And I'm happy to say, across the board, no health claims on even foods that I would consider healthy. I think it should just be a level playing field to inspire consumers to learn for themselves, to seek out their own sort of education around this topic. But it's like once we start allowing foods to make health claims, that's actually, it sounds like on the surface that would be a good thing, like a ranking system for foods and things like that. But there's just too much money involved. And it's like, who's to say what's healthy and what's not?
Right.
So I think just across the board, banning health claims, I think that would be great.
And then leaving it up to consumer choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, I have high hopes for this movement to just create less leverage and more transparency, because I think one of the major things that's gone wrong is we've privatized profits and we've socialized the expense. And when I say socialize the expense, Medicaid, Medicare is picking up the cost of this burgeoning explosive era of chronic disease and type 2 diabetes and morbid obesity. I know you've been outspoken about classifying obesity as a disease and certainly about it being genetic. So talk a little bit about that. I mean, do you think that obesity should be considered a disease?
Yeah, I think it's it's highly responsive to our diets and our lifestyles. So it's not something that we can that we're unable to address with our own agency in the world. But what I push back primarily against is the notion that it's genetic. There are certainly genetic influences, but this idea that it's primarily genetic, that's BS. I mean, obesity has tripled over the past 50 years. Our genes have not changed all that much, you know? But our lifestyle, our food environment has dramatically changed.
Absolutely.
And so,
and from a mental health perspective, what do you think is most, because you're a huge mental health advocate, but what has most dramatically impacted our mental health? And for those folks that are listening, we just gave 5 of the top, supplements for fitness and for sport. What about for good mental health, for cognitive health? We've actually started the discussion on nicotine. I'm not quite there yet. We had this discussion in Baja, but I'm on the precipice of it because I've heard Huberman talk about it. Ben Greenfield's big on it. Dave Asprey and I spoke about it on his podcast. You and I have spoken about it. I'd love to, because I think as soon as you say nicotine, people think cigarettes, vaping. Yeah, we're obviously not talking about those things, but
nicotine. Yeah, nicotine is there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think nicotine has some benefits and it has some definite downsides. The benefits are that it improves cognitive function. It's a well-studied nootropic. It might benefit mental health. Also with fear extinction and things like that. There are a few studies that have
I'm actually
shown
seeing some of the cancer binding site research, which seems to be very promising, with even some oncologists recommending pure nicotine patches for patients that are going through oncology treatment. I don't purport to know the science behind that, but if we just sticking to cognitive function, as a cognitive enhancer, I would say the majority of people over 40 would say I have some level of brain fog, some level of short-term recall issues, or some level of focus and concentration issues. So if we're just isolating cognitive function and the neurotropics, where do you fall on what you feel are the best long-term for our brain health? Aside from maybe the short-term impact of nicotine.
Generally speaking, like aside from nicotine, I would say, choline is definitely important. I try to, prioritize choline in my diet from eggs, red meat, fish, things like that. I think collagen plays an important role in longevity and systemic health. I think brain health probably too.
I think the problem with collagen is people think that we can target direct collagen, right? If you eat collagen, it shows up as collagen in your skin. But, I always use the analogy that we don't eat our nails to grow our nails or eat our hair to grow our hair.
Fair.
And collagen is going to provide, it's an incomplete protein and won't really build muscle, but I think it can become amino acids, which can then become collagen, elastin, fibrin in the skin.
Do you take it? Or
I don't take collagen. I take these perfect aminos, because that's all 8 of the essential amino acids. And these actually have nucleotides in them too. And I take it because it has such a low caloric impact, less than 2 calories. But it provides the equivalent of 29 grams of whey protein. So especially, working out in a fasted state, I find that the essential amino acids, they're essential for a reason. And if you look at metabolic processing conversion, as soon as you're deficient in even a single one of the essential amino acids, the balance of those are going to become fat or sugar. So the 8 essential amino acids in the right ratio is critical. And obviously you can get them from high protein sources, but I think that
way better than BCAAs alone.
Yeah.
You want the full complex,
Because the branched chain amino acids are, just leucine, isoleucine, valine. And usually they're in the right ratios, that 2-to-1 ratio, but the branched chain amino acids are only 3 of the necessary amino acids. And I think the old adage used to be, well, BCAAs are either metabolized at the muscle level or they're the most commonly used at the muscle level. So we should take branched chain amino acids, prior to a workout or during a workout. I think you should take full spectrum of the essential amino acids prior to workout or during a workout, so that you can build anything from that complete protein. You can build natural killer cells, you can build collagen, you can build muscle, you can build anything from those essential amino acids. Well, this is amazing, man. I'm super excited about anything that we can do and our peers can do to have a positive impact on this Make America Healthy Again movement. I'm also not directly involved with the administration, but tangentially, and significantly supporting that movement. So as you know, I ask all my podcast guests, and you can't give me the same answer that you gave last time. Should we look up his last answer?
Ooh, I wonder what it was.
I asked them all the same question at the end of the podcast before we go into my VIP community. And after you answer this, we're going to go into a private room. If you're interested in becoming an Ultimate Human VIP, you can go to theultimatehuman.com and just sign up to be one of my VIP Ultimate Humans. We do private podcasts. I do a lot of one-on-one and group settings, answering questions. We do challenges where we're just building an incredible community of like-minded folks. And I give discounts on all of the products that I endorse. But before we go into the private podcast for my VIP community, I ask all the guests the same question. What does it mean to you to be an ultimate human?
Damn.
That was the shortest answer we've ever had. Great. Thank you, Max.
I completely forgot how I answered it the first time. I don't know. For some reason, my brain is going to like James Bond,
to be really good at karate and shooting with a gun.
Like strong in body, and in intention, and to, and in values, and to be a high integrity person, to be a self-sufficient person. I think that's, and obviously health, I think is a crucial one to embody, making sure that you're strong, that you're, taking care of your body, that you're prioritizing self-care. And then I also think it's important to like show up in the world, presentable, and to have respect for not just your body and your mind, spiritually, your relationships and all that stuff, but also, how you're perceived. Some people scoff at like appearance and things like that. Like it doesn't matter. It's shallow. But, I think like, because my mind went to James Bond, I'm also thinking about, well, he's a person who dressed really well and he showed up really well and he was, always presentable and I think that's why he's such an iconic character. I happen to be a big, James Bond fan. So.
I think everybody growing up was a big James Bond fan.
favorite Bond? Who's your favorite Bond?
What was the English Bond? The heavy accent English actor. I'm having a brain.
What was it?
Right now. Sean Connery. It was actually Sean Connery. He just faked the British accent.
Did he? Oh yeah, I guess you're right.
Yeah, he did. Wow. He
Whoa.
faked a really thick British accent, but I love the Sean.
Mine
Connery.
is Daniel Craig.
Sean Connery was like, he was a badass at 75.
Yeah. He was an ultimate
like Clint
human.
Eastwood, like kind of like tougher and more chiseled at 75 than at 45.
He was, Daniel Craig for me is the GOAT.
Yeah.
Roger Moore?
Roger Moore is your favorite Bond.
Cool. I'm so
there hasn't been a good Bond series in a while.
To know who the next Bond is. Maybe it'll be you, Gary.
Hey, I'm in Universal Studios. I'm here if you guys want to send me a contract. Well, guys, as always, I'll put the links to any of the topics that we talked about below to the extent that they're research. I'll also try to dig up the studies that you referred to if you help my team get those, so I can link those in the podcast below. Where can people find you? I mean, my audience for the most part is familiar with you, but where can people find you?
Yeah, my podcast, The Genius Life, is my pride and joy. So come over and listen to that if you're into podcasts, as I'm sure you are if you listen to this. And I'm also very active on X and Instagram, which I know you are as well. Yeah.
Very. Okay. Well, VIPs, we'll see you in the private room. And the rest of you guys, until next time, that's just science.